Hello, everybody. Good evening. Thank you for coming. My name is Eden Sung, and I am the Chief Operating Officer of the Legal Vocation Fellowship. LVF works to shape the next generation of Christian lawyers through small, regionally based learning cohorts in 7 regions around the country. This week, almost 30 fellows from across these 7 regions have assembled in St. Louis for several days to focus on the reflection of the intersection of law, theology, and vocation. It's my pleasure to welcome you all tonight on behalf of the Legal Vocation Fellowship for a conversation on law, justice, vocation, and the Christian calling with CEO and founder of the International Justice Mission, Gary Haugen, and founder of the Legal Vocation Fellowship, John Inazu. Before founding IJM in 1997, Gary was a human rights attorney with the U.S. Department of Justice, focusing on police misconduct. In 1994, Gary led the United Nations investigation on the genocide in Rwanda. He's the author of several books about the context behind the work of IJM, including The Locust Effect, Why the End of Poverty Requires the End of Violence, and Good News About Injustice, A Witness of Courage in a Hurting World. In addition to founding the Legal Vocation Fellowship, John Inazu is the Sally D. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion here at Washington University. I have the honor of knowing both Gary and John throughout the course of my own vocational journey, as an intern at IJM over 9 years ago and as a WashU Law student afterwards. What marks both Gary and John are not only their remarkable accomplishments, incredible competence as leaders in the fields of their expertise, but also their generosity with their time and talents. Please join me in welcoming Gary and John.
It's great to see all of you. Thanks for being here. And Gary, thanks so much for joining us. It's a real treat to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Delighted.
We've known each other for a long time, and I've been an admirer for a long time. One of the things I told you just a few minutes ago is I've spent most of my teaching career telling incoming Christian law students that they can do something other than the International Justice Mission, that there are other paths to being a Christian lawyer.
Why are you undermining us, John?
I think of it more of as a partnership to help spread the
Okay, that's how
you
see it.
I similarly tell my friend Rick Garnett that he should not hire all the Christian law professors to Notre Dame, but also send them elsewhere. Gary, I would love, just for people who might not know, if we could start by just giving us a little bit of an overview about the International Justice Mission, and then we'll talk some about your career, and I've got some questions for you about how you think about these tough issues at the intersection of faith and law and the use of violence and sometimes getting justice done. We'll go for 45 minutes or so, and then we'll turn it over to you all in the audience for some questions as well. But why don't we start
with... If there's anybody still here.
We're going to keep everyone on their toes tonight. But yeah, let's start with just telling us about the vision and the work of the International Justice Mission.
Yeah, thanks, John, and thank you all for coming. Delighted to be with you. International Justice Mission started in 1997, and it really was focused on the problem of violence against the poor. And from my own experience as a Christian engaged in and an interest in the work of the gospel in the world, there seemed to be a lot of ministries and organizations that would address evangelism and church planting, address problems of hunger and medical care, lack of education or employment. And my wife and I had friends who were involved in these types of ministries around the world. But we noticed that there was a gap when it came to the problem of violence against the poor. And this became manifest very powerfully when I was the director of the UN's genocide investigation in Rwanda, a country which when I arrived, a few weeks after the genocide, I was given a list of about 100 different mass graves and massacre sites. And we were just sorting through all of the physical evidence of hundreds of thousands of people who had been murdered, interviewing the survivors to try to get the match of sort of the physical evidence with the story that was being told, that we were beginning to try to develop the evidence that would be brought against the leaders of the genocide. And I found in in all of these communities, it was very, very difficult to get people to talk until you could start to communicate with and engage with some of their church leaders, their ministry leaders, their priests. And you could start to find that everywhere where the violence took place, there were Christian workers addressing food and medical needs and other needs. But there was no solution when the guys with machetes showed up. And then I had some other friends who were working with street kids in the Philippines, and they were providing shelter and food and care, but they started to notice some of the young girls were not showing up to the program. They would look around to try to find them. 2 of them in particular had been abducted into a brothel that was being run by the local police. And so that was a situation in which they didn't know what to do. Are we supposed to stop thinking about these 2 girls? Are we supposed to take on the Manila police who are running a brothel? And at the time, I was on the police misconduct task force at the U.S. Department of Justice, and I didn't know how to do any ministry things, but if you've got a brothel being run by police, that's something I actually would know something about what to do. So IJM was set up initially as a response to the problem of violence against the poor, which as we surveyed tens of thousands of workers serving amongst the poor, we found those categories of violence were violence against women and children, usually gender violence, sexual violence and domestic abuse, intimate partner violence, forced labor, human trafficking and slavery, police abuse, and land theft. And so IJM started about 30 years ago, building small teams in the developing world of local criminal investigators, lawyers, and social workers. And they just took on individual cases and would try to bring the people who are being abused out of that situation of abuse, try to work with the authorities to bring the perpetrators to justice, and then provide connections to quality aftercare so they could see restoration. And so we just supported these local indigenous teams of Cambodians or Salvadorians or Kenyans working in their own communities, just trying to get the law that was already on the books enforced when violence took place against very vulnerable poor people in the community. And we did that for about 15 years, built these teams, and so they were working thousands and thousands of cases. But if you do that for a long time, you can imagine yourself starting to think, well, what I really wish is that this violence didn't take place in the first place. And secondly, it really isn't the job of a little faith-based NGO to be protecting the poor from violence. That's the job of the local justice system. And our teams had to work with the justice system to reach any successful outcome in any of their cases. So they would work thousands of cases through the plumbing of the justice system. And so they began to think, wonder if we can begin to work to strengthen the justice system so it actually does what it's supposed to do in this community, which is enforce the law and provide great services to survivors. So this is a really long answer to you. Is this all right? Okay. So we did that for about 15 years in some demonstration projects and also began to develop the ways to measure, is the justice system performance getting better and is the violence decreasing? And in 9 of our demonstration projects, it took on average 6 or 7 years, but we saw decreases in slavery and violence of between 50 and 85%. Like at the Department of Justice, if you reduced violent crime by about 4%, you were a hero. But these are communities that had such an absence of the rule of law that when they had rule of law in relation to these forms of violence, the levels of violence just collapsed. So that's what IJM does. We have about 1,500 staff around the world in about 33 different locations across the developing world. And again, these are local nationals who also are a community of Christian spiritual formation, but they do this work of strengthening the local justice system so it will protect those who are most vulnerable and poorest in their community.
I should say again here, there are other things you can do as a Christian lawyer. It's extraordinary.
It's so cool. It's unbelievable.
It sounds. What strikes me as you're telling that story, that the 1,000th case is hard, but the first case and the second case are even harder, and the 7-year proof is extremely important, but the 1 month proof is hard. So talk about how you build trust and how you do the work with people who have to play a very long game and can't just have overnight results.
Oh, yeah, and to be clear, the International Justice Mission, which we made up as a name that sounded really impressive, like in year one, like it was just 3 of us, right? I mean, that's International Justice Mission. And I think we had 3 successful cases in the first year, and that was unbelievable. And we hoped that we could have 3 next year. 2 would be okay, 1 would be sad, like 5 would be amazing. Just help 5 people. Because if it was you or someone you loved, it'd be like more than enough. And so that was year 1 and year 2. And as a journey of faith, which is what this was from the very beginning, it was like, well, I think Jesus says to do for others what you would want done for you. And if you were in that horrific situation of someone violently abusing you, you'd want someone to help you get out of it. You'd love to see the people who were doing it brought to account, to justice, and you'd like to be restored. And so we just started doing that. And but it was just case by case by case. It was like Mother Teresa used to say, she ended up, I think, pulling about 40,000 people off the streets of Calcutta over her 50 years or so of service. But she would just say it just started with 1, and then 2, and then 3. So, yeah, I would just, the thing that's so powerful to me is that it's an out-of-body experience from my perspective of what I think God has given us favor to do in bringing casework to larger scale and then beginning to turn to actually transform a justice system so it actually does what it's supposed to be doing. Because the biggest thing that has happened now is that there are places in the world where people are seeing for the first time a justice system do what it's supposed to do. Well, they would have otherwise never even seen that before. So the recovery of hope is one of the most powerful things.
When you were just starting off, you pivoted from sort of a traditional successful career. You checked the right boxes, gone to the right schools, you had these prestigious jobs. Was this a sense of extreme calling where you just knew this was the thing, or was there a sense of giving up something, a different dream, or how did you discern in those early days of how to do this?
Yeah, thanks for asking. It's a great story, I think, because it's mostly a story of finding out what you're really afraid of in life. Because, when I was young, I always knew I wanted to be a lawyer. Like when I was in 2nd grade, I got the, Meet Mr. Lincoln book, and he was a lawyer and stuff, and so I want to become a lawyer. And so I ended up working at the Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division, and but my heart had started from some other experiences to start to be captivated by what was happening in the larger world. Outside the borders of the United States. So I started to become a bit more interested in that. And I sensed that there was this gap in the kind of work that Christians did in poor communities in terms of addressing violence. So, okay, let's start something called International Justice Mission, great name. And it started by surveying, as I said, tens of thousands of people who are working amongst the poor. And we asked them one question: do you see people suffering violence and abuse under circumstances in which local authorities cannot be relied upon for relief? How many of your friends who are working in very poor communities would answer yes to that? Well, 100% of them said so. And then, what do you do about it, or do you feel like you have someone to turn to? And the indication was clear they didn't. So great, okay, there's a need, so let's start something to try to address it. So it does mean I got to leave my job at the Department of Justice. I got to, tell my friends and family at Christmas I'm going to start a justice club, and would you give me $30 a month maybe to help me do that? That put together, like, what's 11 times $30 a month? That's sort of what I got. And what I also found out is that I was so afraid of moving forward with this, actually not because I was afraid of the violent circumstances that we were going to be stepping into. That was hard, but that was not the thing, nor because I had a wife and 4 kids at the time as well, and so we're trying to figure out how to pay for life. And so I'm going to leave my job at the Department of Justice, which I also began by asking for a leave of absence, let's be clear, because 90% chance my Justice Club is going to fail, and so I would like my real justice job back. No one at the Department of Justice thought I was that special, and so they're like, good luck to you, friend, if you want to go. So like, dang, okay. So, but even that of sort of providing for my family was, no one's going to die just because this little adventure doesn't succeed. We'll go live with my parents or something like that. So, but what I was most afraid of was looking like a failure. To go back to that family reunion or whatever, and like, so how's the Justice Club going? Like, yeah, that failed. So to tell you the truth, I did have this sense of amazing opportunity, like do what you always have ever wanted to do, and maybe respond to real need in the world. That seemed like real need. So there's the opportunity. There's the sense of joy and vigor of heart around it, and it feels like God will be ready to go with you. And yes, there's risks associated with it, but the real reason I was afraid to do it was because I was afraid of looking like a failure. And that was just a really powerful learning. And what was so helpful is like, once I figured out, oh, that's what it is, I then thought, well, do I want to be like 50-something or like 62 years old like I am now? And like, I never did the thing. Why? Because I didn't want to look like a failure. That just felt so pathetic to say it like that then I'm like, well, let's give it a go. And then God was super nice.
I love that. And I love it because today people think of the International Justice Mission and it equals success, at least in the eyes of the world, a worldly organization that's doing extremely important, powerful work, but is also successful. And you've now brought us back to a time when it might not have been, right? And that it's that moment of trust and faith. I think as I think about some of the younger attorneys with us this week, you don't know up front. You're making a step of faith, and it might not work out. You might be going back to the family reunion and saying it didn't work, and that's also part of trusting and discerning along the way.
And as long as that was the driving insecurity inside of me, it was going to be contorting all kinds of things, no matter what sphere I headed into, and especially if you're going to go into the do-gooder sphere. And now this is really just about you not wanting to look in a certain way to other humans. That's going to go really badly.
Mm-hmm. You talked earlier about the formative experience of Rwanda, and I know also important to your own journey and development was time in South Africa. Could you share some about that?
Yeah, so my college experience was super formative. I went to Harvard College, and which basically means I was the undereducated public school kid from California who goes to Harvard University. So I'm feeling totally insecure, basically. And but there I go off as a convinced, quite earnest Christian by that point. And what I do find is a tremendously robust, small Christian fellowship that was really interested in exploring the deeper questions of life, which one of them just is the reality of human suffering. I didn't have a whole lot of human suffering in my bubble that I lived in, and just the process of going to live in a city. Boston was a city at the end of the 70s, had a lot of racial violence and tension. There was a lot of poverty and homelessness starting to emerge tremendously. And I was in a fellowship of Christians who were like, hey, what do you think Jesus thinks about this? And so that was a really helpful journey for me. I would just add that a big part of that was earnest, convinced Christian who then was honestly just encountering in Bible study where Jesus says, "By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another." And I'm like, don't know a human on the earth who would say, "I know Gary's a Christian because of the way that he loves other people." That seems like a problem. Main point, Gary not getting it. Though I think there was two reasons for that. One, I don't think Christians were associated with being loving, sadly. And I certainly was not one of those who was at all above average in that. And so then it was like, okay, what does that mean? And then what does it mean to love? This is the other big thing, those who are hurting in the world. And just beginning the little steps of what does that mean to draw close to human suffering. And I had a few experiences in college where I experienced my maker in proximity to human suffering that was totally new and different. And so I felt this sense of lean into that. In 1985, when I graduated, the big issue on college campus was the apartheid in South Africa. By a series of, I had been very interested in the civil rights movement in the United States, and so then I was very interested in what was going on in South Africa. And so I got the opportunity to just go work as an intern for Bishop Tutu. Now, I know you're thinking like, who gets to do that? Well, it's just, so I just show up, and by a random set of circumstances, Bishop Tutu and these other church leaders have now become the political leaders in South Africa for the black community, because the other black political leaders are either in prison because Nelson Mandela is still in prison, or they're in exile. And so I was making photocopies and tea and carrying bags for Bishop Tutu and these other church leaders as they were taking on this horrific struggle against the apartheid regime. And that was completely formative for me to watch this as a 22-year-old, 23. And the biggest thing out of that was to see what it looks like when a human being is no longer afraid. I saw Bishop Tutu and other church leaders who were totally normal people too. They all had flaws and they're all hilarious in their own way, but there were moments when they were no longer afraid of anything or anyone else, because the apartheid regime was going to test that on you for sure, because we knew other pastors who had been, and other leaders who had been abducted and who had been jailed and killed. And so it was going to test, what do you actually believe? And Bishop Tutu and some of these other church leaders acted as if the things that Jesus taught were actually true, and they lived with an ability of, with a freedom from fear, which if you witness as a 20-something-year-old, I think is very formative. So that was a big deal for me.
And can you talk some about, in your journey since then, because I imagine there have been plenty of times when you've confronted fear and evil and suffering, and what are your own resources, and what do you do when you see this enormity that feels beyond something that you can conquer? I mean, I know we could say I pray and all these things, but how do you in your soul manage what is really the work that brings you in proximity with real evil, real violence, real suffering, real pain?
I pray, John. That's
great. That's leading the witness.
Well, I love Dallas Willard's definition of prayer. He says, prayer is talking to God about what we're doing together. So I learned from those pastors and church leaders in South Africa what prayer looked like and what a life of prayer was, a life of talking to God about what we're doing together. And it's going to get hairy, right? So those conversations get honest, and this is not going well, God, and really you want us to do that? Or that went really badly, God, like where were you? And I just always found him showing up disproportionately to whatever I gave him of space to be with me and to manifest his love and his goodness and his forgiveness. So one of the things I do found is confronting hard things gets easier with God the more you do it. So I saw him show up enough times with grace and power that it convinced me, like, more than I had been, that I bet he'll do this again. And there's no guarantee on that, which is why it wouldn't be exciting if it was. But so part of it was just, if I look back on it, was just this compounding muscle that grows to trust God the more you put him to the test in the right way and see him show up for you. And then the second thing would be definitely doing it in community. Because there's some days like, I am not believing this at all, but my colleague might, and the strength. We're meant to do it, I think, together. And then also the coming up for air to experience joy and beauty and goodness in life. We sometimes say to each other that joy is the oxygen of doing hard things. Like, if you try to just stay submerged in the darkness, in the grim horribleness, you're just not going to do that sustainably. So the intentionality of pursuing joy and beauty and goodness and doing that as a spiritual discipline. As I said, like, Bishop Tutu is hilarious. You've never seen a guy laugh so hard. And he had a capacity to come up for air so that he could then go down back into the darkness. So doing it in community, doing in prayerful conversation with God in community. And I will also say something that's very counterintuitive, which is solitude and silence. So I'm like an active guy, so the idea of like solitude and silence doesn't seem like anything's going to get done during that time. So, but at IJM, as a spiritual discipline, everybody spends the first half hour of the day in solitude and silence, just to spiritually prepare the interior, because it's going to be rough what's coming, I'm guessing. If it's anything like yesterday, it is. And then we work for 2 hours, and then we break, and then we get together for another half hour of prayer together. So that rhythm, whether you feel like it or not, of taking every morning to allow, to take an inventory of what the heck is going on the interior, so that you are not leading and working out of all this just unconscious stuff that's happening. Instead, having a nice conversation with your maker before you enter into the day. That discipline has been super, super helpful.
I'm wondering, in addition to sort of the day-to-day struggle and sometimes crying out to God, were there moments as you were building this organization, this movement, this ministry, where you just thought, this isn't working, where it just felt too insurmountable? And can you talk about what that was like?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you exactly the grocery store parking lot I was in, having a very unmanly weep because we had run out of money. So there were 5 of us at IJM. We were maybe almost 2 years into it, and I discovered something I'd never heard of before called cash flow. It turns out that just because you have enough money at the end of the year, if you don't have it in between when you need to pay the other 5 people, your organization ends. So, so there was a point where we just literally ran out of money, and so IJM was over. And I remember in the parking lot thinking, wow, I didn't know how this was going to fail. I thought it would probably fail, but I didn't know specifically how it was, but now I do. And this is super sad. Also because we were starting to see what was possible. And there was also just terrible moments where we definitely failed in our intention to bring effective aid to people who really needed it. And because you can't control the outcomes of those things. And it's very hard because a lot of times they'd be children and we'd have undercover video of what was being done to them, what was happening to them. And you'd never see those kids again. Or the children who would, pass in a hospital bed from AIDS because you could not attend to the consequences of what had been done to them. So there are just lots and lots of very, very hard and frightening, heartbreaking things that are completely embedded into the journey.
Let me ask you the other sort of side of the coin here, which is you started as the Justice Club with $100,000 in your annual budget, and now you have 1,500 employees and over $100 million that you're budgeting each year. So you're both doing really important and good work, and you are succeeding. And as a Christian, how do you guard against the temptations of success and relevance, even knowing that you're anchoring and you're doing something really important, and yet it's also working in the eyes of the world, and you're getting recognition and a degree of fame, and how do you balance that in kind of your personal journey?
Yeah, most of it's just an attentiveness to your own frailty as a human. We gathered 70 of our senior leaders for a week together, and a lot of it is just rest and encouragement, and the heart of it is 2 days of just solitude and silence in the morning. And the preparation for that, the big sort of biblical focus for us was James chapter 4. It says, come now, you who boast that you're going to go to this and that city and spend this amount of time there and make this amount of money. You don't even know what tomorrow's going to bring. What is your life? You're a mist that is here today and dissipates. Better to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and go do this or that. As such, all such boasting is evil. And we were just reflecting on, yes, that can apply to somebody who's going and making money. But don't be too harsh on the folks making money, because the only reason we're able to do what we do is because people are making money and sharing that. That's the only reason the International Justice Mission gets to do what it's doing. But we are no less susceptible to that arrogance, which at the end of the day, though, is just a sad insecurity. Because you are just clearly not understanding reality if you are not appreciating that all of these things are contingent, they're not certain, and what we struggle with at IJM, just because we're human, a lot of us, is that we will, if we're high performers, we're going to build a sense of self and a sense of identity and value and security on our performance and our position. And these are 70 leaders of a well-regarded, not-for-profit organization, and they got there because they're really good at what they do. But oh Lord, if our sense of self and value and security is rooted in that, that's just a really weak position. And so we were talking about the way I think that the greatest ceiling on a very capable leader is the fragile insecurity of arrogance. For a set of reasons. And yet nothing I see is more powerful than the great security of the humble. And so all that to say, the only way to do it, I think, is to be really conscious of the inclination to, as it says in the Old Testament, when your barns become full, you will forget me. And so success will separate you from reality. I think that's the main thing. And the main thing for a human is to stay super connected to reality. And Jesus has some teaching about what's real and what's false, and so that's what we try to stay really close to.
You early on tonight, you talked about the existing do-gooder ministries before IJM, but one of the things that strikes me about those ministries is they're often giving people food or healing the sick, these kinds of activities that look in some sense pure. It's easy to think of the mission-minded person who is helping people with care. IJM uses force sometimes. I mean, the reality of putting the bad guys away and stopping them from doing violence often requires the use of violence against them, governmental institutions that exercise violence on their own, sometimes very imperfect institutions. Can you talk some about the reality and the role of force and violence in the work that you do and how you see that as a Christian and as a ministry?
Yeah, sure. And to be clear, IJM always would have to work through government authorities in any coercive way.
You don't go in by yourself to...
Well, no, John. As much as you would like to, I can see it. No, it's a great question because we do need a coherent understanding of a Christian view of state power. And there's a couple thousand years of various teachings on this. But one of the things that was so manifest to me and from Scripture is that violence is a particular form of sin in the world that's a product of the fall. That's one of the first things that happens, right? Cain kills Abel. It's violence into the world. God says in the flood, he's grown tired of the world because of their violence. And so what's also true from Scripture, as you can see, is that God's temporary solution to that, prior to him establishing the fullness of his kingdom, is he establishes the state. Rulers and authorities with a measure of coercive power, sometimes called the sword in Romans 13, to do what? To restrain the abuse of power. And so first there are the judges following Moses, and then the Israelites really want a king, and so they get a king, and lots of kings. But then you basically have hundreds of kings to whom the prophets go, because the prophets are calling the rulers back to their divine commission for the use of the power, which is to protect those who are weak and vulnerable. Every single biblical prophet will call the king to account for two things. One, idolatry. The other is the failure to protect those who are weak and vulnerable in their midst. Or worse, using their power to abuse them. So, in other sense, the police power, the regulated use by the state of a coercive power is a temporary solution that God is using in the world to restrain the aftermath of the fall. And so the role of the body of Christ, substantially, is to aid, support, call, and rebuke as necessary the state to its proper use of its coercive power. So we could go on and on about this, but that is what IJM tries to do in a way through its justice system strengthening projects, is to help governments actually use their coercive power in a regulated and proper way to actually restrain the violent abuse of those who are most vulnerable. And it does require entering into broken and compromised systems for sure, but that is the world that God has called us to minister into, and so that's what we try to do.
Let's talk about this notion of justice. And one of the courses that I teach is criminal law, and in that course and in talking with students, there's this almost innate human desire. When you see a wrong, you want to see it righted. When you see an injustice, you want justice. And yet in reality, we don't actually get complete justice in this world, right? When there's a remedy or there's a rescue, it doesn't completely undo the harm that has occurred or the loss that people have felt. So how do you navigate your sense of Christian justice, big J, that is promised with the imperfect justice that is meted out in this world, and in your work with other leaders and other movements? Is this a tension point when you're working especially with people who don't share your faith convictions? How do you talk about something, justice in the world, that isn't actually quite justice that you believe in?
Well, it's pretty interesting because over the last 150 years, there's been a large level of consensus about basic standards of human rights. And what International Justice Mission does through its projects, through these local teams, is, first of all, we deal with forms of violence against the poor that are just already against the law. And in every country now, forced labor and human trafficking, sexual violence, there are actually standards of what it is the police are and are not supposed to do in the codes of all these countries. And so in what we are actually doing on a day-to-day basis is just seeking the effective implementation of the aspiration that's already well articulated in each one of these cultures about what justice is. So what I am much more taken by is how much humans actually do agree on this. They just very inconsistently carry it out. And so that's what we're mostly working on. So, yeah, I am seized by the fascinating problem of actual practical execution of things we know to be right. And those are fascinating endeavors and engagements. And I think if we could make a huge percentage increase in the number of stuff we were actually executing on that we know to be right, I think that would be a tremendous improvement.
We've got one more question for you, and then we'll turn it over to...
Was that an evasion of what you meant?
It was, yeah. I was just going to let it go, but no, it was still a wonderful answer. So he's a lawyer too. My last question before we switch to audience questions is, you speak to a lot of lawyers, a lot of young lawyers. There are a lot of young lawyers in this audience tonight. What advice do you have for them as they're discerning how to think about a career in law? What would you advise them to prioritize, to warn against, to think about in the coming years?
Yeah, I have found myself when asked that question with a pretty clear response. And I don't know if it's very helpful, but I'll just give you what I feel, which is I would just encourage, especially young lawyers, to follow the joy. If you're not enjoying your life, work a different plan. Because God intended for you to enjoy your life. And there are lots of reasons why humans find joy dissipating. One of them that tends to be connected to the legal field, I find, is humans take joy in a sense of meaningful purpose. So if a lawyer is spending gajillion hours being a lawyer and doesn't find meaningful purpose in that, then that's gonna suck. or there's a more theological term for that. It's gonna be joyless, I think. But it's amazing. The one reason I say that is because I've known so many lawyers for so many decades, and the propensity to do stuff that isn't very joyful for a really, really, really long time, I would just recommend not doing that. Which usually just comes from an examination of, well, why am I doing this? Why am I afraid to leave the Department of Justice to go pursue this thing? What am I afraid of? James Thurber said, before one dies, one should figure out what they're running to and what they're running from and why. And so that is, I believe, because I have also seen lawyers in every kind of iteration or manifestation find tremendously meaningful purpose and joy in what they do. One of my very best friends was basically the best corporate tax lawyer in America. And he loved corporate tax. He was compensated tremendously for his love for corporate tax. He also was he was in my Bible study in church and was the first chairman of the board of International Justice Mission, which, if you remember, was only 3 of us. So this is not a prominent position. This is just something that he did because he loved me. And he and Cheryl took care of the kids sometime. And he told Jan, my wife, that, we'll take care of Gary if something happens along this early path of things. And he found enormous joy and purpose in that form, and I have found every in between. So I think it's possible, but I think it's that level of intentionality and that really just Jesus intends for us to bring no matter what it is. Because I come from a family of doctors too, and doctors, the way professions can evolve, they can move a long way from their animating ideal. Behind law, I think the animating ideal is justice. But in a complicated and affluent society, it's really the regulation of a lot of complex rules. And so, same thing with the medical field. I think the animating ideal is healing. But I also know enormously compensated surgeons who fix the elbows of professional baseball players, and that's kind of cool, but in a way, it's not saving people from dying and healing in a way that I think is its deepest aspiration. Well compensated, perhaps, but not as near the the ideal that undergirds it. So, if one finds oneself and that's okay, because there's a certain bait and switch that happens in law school, I think. It's like, it's about justice. And it's like, no, it's all these complicated rules for which you'll be enormously compensated. Now, that doesn't mean tremendous joy can't be found in that and in things in between. But it's just an awareness, an intentionality of what's happening to me. And is this what I would want and love, and why? Because I think Jesus has an enormously joyful and transformational, purposeful, unleashing of his kingdom into the world through all of us and all the various manifestations of life in the law.
Thank you. That's great.